Alright, let's dive into Gao E's sequel and talk about the good and bad parts. I mentioned it earlier, these are the last 40 chapters. That's where the tragic love story between Baoyu and Dayu unfolds. But there's this one thing that just doesn't sit well with us, the whole switcheroo plot. Seriously, how on earth did Baochai agree to that? It's just not like her character, and it feels way too cheap. And as for me, pretending to be Dayu, there's no way I could handle it. We'll never know why it happened that way. Personally, after thinking it through, it shouldn't have been like that. But we can't deny that the tragic ending of Baoyu and Dayu's love story, which we talked about earlier, has some literary value in the lengthy description that follows Dayu hearing the news. So, in the last 40 chapters of Dream of the Red Chamber, there are some ups and downs, some parts respecting the setup from earlier in the story, and some that just don't. Take Shifeng's death, for example. Gao E writes it as her falling ill and passing away, which just doesn't feel right. Yeah, the endings of the other characters, like Xiren, totally fit with what was hinted at earlier. Xiren and Jiang Yuhan were really close, you know? They were both top-notch people, and their friendship ran deep. One time, Baoyu gave his handkerchief to Jiang Yuhan, and in return, Jiang Yuhan gave her handkerchief to Baoyu. They swapped them, you know? But when Baoyu got back home, Xiren noticed that the handkerchief she had made for him was missing. Baoyu explained that he had exchanged it with someone else, and that made Xiren upset. When Xiren gets upset, Baoyu has to figure out how to make things right, you know? So later, when Xiren was asleep, Baoyu tied the handkerchief Jiang Yuhan gave him around her waist. The next morning, when Xiren woke up and found the handkerchief on her, she took it off. But instead of tossing it away, she kept it in an empty box. That handkerchief belonged to Jiang Yuhan, right? And the fact that she didn't throw it away, but kept it in a box, is already a hint of things to come. It's like foreshadowing, showing that something will be resolved or addressed later on. So, after Baoyu ran away, what happened to all those maids in the Yihong garden? Well, Zijuan, no surprise there, decided to become a nun with Shichuan and said, I gotta join the clergy now. But why did Shichuan want to become a nun in the first place? Well, you see, before Miaoyu got kidnapped by a bandit, she didn't dare to openly express her desire to be a nun. If she did, guess who would get all the blame? Yup, Miaoyu. Our girl was corrupted by that sneaky Miaoyu and now wants to hide away in a convent. Now, in Chinese society back then, it was considered a big shame for a high-class lady from a wealthy and respected family to become a nun. So, naturally, they would be totally against it. But since Miaoyu was no longer in the picture, Shichuan was dead set on becoming a nun. She wouldn't to hurt Miaoyu anymore, you know? It just shows how considerate she is. But becoming a nun at that time was like dodging a bullet, let me tell you. But because Shichuan was so insistent, Lady Wang had no choice but to give in. And once she agreed, they needed maids to take care of Shichuan, but those maids would have to stay unmarried forever. Who would be up for that? Well, Zijuan didn't waste a second and volunteered right away. So, what about Xiren and the others? What do we do with them? What is Xiren, anyway? Baoyu's supposed wife, right? But she doesn't have any official status or title. Shifeng had suggested to Lady Wang, since you're so fond of her and find her obedient and reliable, why not bring her into the family? It's kind of like what Xue Pan did with Xiangling before he married his proper wife. But later, Lady Wang said it wouldn't be right. First of all, Baoyu is still young. Secondly, Lord Rong might not approve. Just being all proper on the surface, you know? And thirdly, it was Lady Wang's own idea. If they brought Xiren into the family, she thought Xiren might have less influence over Baoyu as a concubine. And then Baoyu might not listen to Lady Wang anymore. So, they decided it's better to keep things as they are and give Xiren a status similar to what Gao E has. But now that Baoyu has gone off to become a monk and is never coming back, that whole situation is settled. So, what do we do with Xiren now? She's made up her mind, as she was completely devoted to Baoyu. But with Baoyu gone, she knows there's no reason for her to stay a widow because she doesn't have any official recognition, right? It just doesn't make sense for her to stay in the Jia household. Eventually, she'll have to get married. But deep down, she doesn't want to because she's always been Baoyu's. Her loyalty to him is unwavering. So, later on, they were introduced to each other through. And guess who's marrying her? It's Jiang Yuhan. Hey, I bet Jiang Yuhan is doing pretty well these days, huh? He's from a wealthy family and has some cash. He was really serious about marrying Xiren from the Jia family, but he had no clue who he was actually marrying. But he knew that the Jia family had some top-notch maidservants. So, he decided to take her as his bride, and just before getting on the wedding sedan, Xiren was thinking to herself, I can't die in the Jia family, it would cause a huge commotion. So go to someone else's house and die. Eventually, when Xiren reached Jiang's house, his entire family treated her with great respect and followed all the proper traditions. Jiang Yuhan welcomed her as his legal wife. However, deep down, Xiren was worried that her presence might cause harm to others if she stayed. So, she hesitated for a while, but in the end, nothing happened. On their wedding night, Jiang and Xiren were supposed to be together, but she refused to be with him. Jiang didn't push her and nothing happened that night. The next morning, Xiren opened her dowry box and Jiang saw his own handkerchief. He realized that she was Xiren, the maid who served Baoyu. Jiang Yuhan and Baoyu had a deep emotional connection. They understood each other on an intellectual level, so when Jiang discovered Xiren's past with Baoyu, he respected her even more. He treated her kindly and with care, making Xiren even more important to him. This turned out to be a favorable outcome for Xiren in the end. Xiren's fate was just as the earlier chapters had hinted at. And when the authorities came and raided their palaces, who were the ones with the most guilt? It was Jia Shi and Jia Zhen, from Ning Palace. And what happened to them later? They were banished. This whole ordeal tore the family apart. After this disaster struck, was there anything Granny Jia could do to handle it? Well, all she could do was pray for blessings upon her descendants and distribute her savings. Granny Jia was smart enough to see early on that the family was on the decline. She had her own little treasure chest, which was quite substantial, I must say. She distributed it in an orderly manner, making sure that everyone got their fair share. Jia Zheng saw how Granny Jia carefully distributed their remaining wealth, and it made him realize that it was to keep the family going. He felt overwhelmed with shame, to the point of shedding tears, as he confessed to his mother how unfilial they had been. He had even more admiration for his mother's wisdom. But all these events, they come later in the story. Of course, we can't forget about what happened to the rest of the gang, including Yuan Yang. After Grandma Jia kicked the bucket, she knew her days were numbered. She figured if Jia Shi ever came back, she'd have no way out. Yuan Yang realized she only stayed alive because of Grandma Jia. She was like her guardian angel, and when Grandma Jia passed, she decided to follow suit. She ended up hanging herself, and one by one, things went downhill for the rest of the crew, mostly ending in disaster and death. Shifeng also bit the dust, Yuan Yang too, Tan Chun married some dude from far away, and Ying Chun got tortured to death by her husband when she was still young. Ying Chun's old man set her up with this bad marriage. Her hubby was from the Sun family, right? When the Jia family was still in power, he tried to cozy up and ended up marrying Yingchun. But as the Jia family lost its clout, he started making life miserable for Yingchun, and she ended up kicking the bucket from the abuse. Lots of other folks had their own ups and downs in the future society. So, who's this Jia Yuan guy, you ask? We all know him pretty well, right? It was the Jia and Wang families that helped him get his official job back. He seemed like a real buddy of the Jia family, always dropping by and insisting on seeing Baoyu. But this guy really stuck it to the Jia family. One of the reasons the Jia family went down the tubes was because of Jia Yuan. But because he got too greedy, he got his comeuppance later on. The government sacked him, and he was never able to get an official job again. He ended up living out his days as an average Joe. Xuepen went and did something really bad, and at that point, the Jia family couldn't do a darn thing to help him out. He got locked up and then got the chop when autumn rolled around. So, how does Dream of the Red Chamber wrap up? Well, let's find out.